It was cold, it was calculated, it was planned, and he then disappeared, and we didn't know where he was.
On the morning of December 7th, 1971, Pearl Harbor Day, a detail nobody noted at the time, a neighbor of the List family in Westfield, New Jersey, called the police to report that something seemed wrong at the house on Hillside Avenue. She had been noticing things for several weeks. The lights in the big house were on at all hours. The same lights, the same pattern, day and night, as if nobody was adjusting them. The curtains had not moved. No one had come or gone that she could see. The newspaper delivery had stopped. The mail was not being collected. And there was music. Through the windows of the Victorian mansion, barely audible from the sidewalk, organ music was playing. Lutheran hymns, church music, the kind of devotional sounds that you would associate with Sunday morning rather than Tuesday night or Thursday afternoon. It played continuously, the same piece cycling over and over, the same chords filling the empty rooms of a house that showed no signs of life. The police entered through a window. The house had 19 rooms, a ballroom with oak floors, marble fireplaces throughout, a Tiffany-stained glass skylight in the entrance hall, the bones of what had once been a genuinely grand residence. The bones were still there, but the house had been declining for years. Wallpaper peeling, heating insufficient, the specific atmosphere of a place that was being maintained at the minimum level by people who could not afford what the house demanded. In the ballroom, the officers found 4 bodies arranged in sleeping bags on the floor. They were laid out in a row, carefully, as if by someone who had thought about the arrangement. Helen List, 46, the wife. Patricia List, 16, the eldest daughter. John List, Jr., 15. Frederick List, 13. They had been shot. The blood had dried weeks ago. In the 3rd floor apartment, they found the 5th body. Alma List, 84 years old, the mother. She had been shot above the left eye and had fallen where she stood. She was the only one who had not been carried to the ballroom. She was the only one he had not been able to carry down the stairs. On the kitchen counter, they found a letter. 5 pages, handwritten, in the careful and measured hand of a man who worked with numbers. It was addressed to the family's pastor at Redeemer Lutheran Church. It explained everything: the financial situation, the reasons, the religious reasoning, the conclusion. It was organized and thorough and completely devoid of what most people would recognize as emotion. It was signed John E. List. He had been gone for 28 days. The officer who found the intercom panel in the kitchen turned it off. The organ music stopped. The house was silent for the first time since November 9th. The organ music had been playing since November 9th, 1971, when John List had taped a recording to the intercom to play on a continuous loop. Church music, Lutheran hymns, the specific sounds of devotion that had organized his life since childhood, and had then turned off most of the lights in the 19 rooms, left a smaller number on to suggest habitation from the outside, and driven his brown 1963 Chevrolet Impala to Kennedy Airport in New York City, parked it in the long-term lot, and boarded a plane. He was 46 years old. He had a degree in accounting from the University of Michigan. He was a Sunday school teacher and a Boy Scout troop leader. He had been, to every person who knew him, the specific embodiment of the respectable, religious, productive American family man, a man of order and discipline and Lutheran faith whose outer life presented no visible crack from which anything dangerous might emerge. And he had, on November 9th, killed his wife, his mother, and his 3 children with 2 handguns, and then driven to the airport and disappeared. The letter he left explained his reasoning in the organized way of a man who had thought about this for a long time. The family had financial problems that were beyond resolution. His wife Helen's health was deteriorating. She had syphilis, contracted from a previous marriage before she met John, and the treatment was not working, and her mental and physical condition was declining. His eldest child, Patricia, was involved with a theatre group that List disapproved of, associating with people and ideas that he feared were pulling her away from the Lutheran faith. His son, John Jr., had expressed doubts about Christianity. His youngest, Frederick, was being raised in a world of declining moral standards. He had concluded, after prayer and consideration, that the merciful thing was to kill them. If they died before they had fully turned away from God, their souls could be saved. If they continued to live in the world that was pulling them away from the faith, they might turn away entirely and be damned. He also noted in the letter that he would turn himself in, that he intended to be available for divine and earthly judgment, that he did not expect to escape the consequences of what he had done. He turned himself in 18 years later. John Emil List was born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan, a city on Saginaw Bay in the lower part of the state. Once a significant lumber town, by the time of List's birth, a mid-sized working-class city with a substantial German-American community that expressed itself in Lutheran churches and the specific culture of orderly, disciplined Protestant domesticity. His parents were John Frederick List and Alma Maria List, devout Lutherans, disciplined, rigid in their expectations of proper behavior and proper belief. His father was present but not warm, a man who modeled through his conduct rather than his affection. His mother was the dominant presence, devoted to her son in the intense, encompassing way of women who have organized their primary emotional life around their children and who find in the child a vehicle for aspirations that have not been otherwise fulfilled. He was an only child. He had no friends. This was not entirely by temperament, though temperament played a role. His mother's strictness about associations, where he could go, which children he could spend time with, what activities were permissible, so severely constrained the social landscape available to him that the normal childhood process of building friendships and developing social competence simply did not happen. He spent his childhood in his own house, with his mother reading the Bible, attending Sunday school, studying, developing the inner isolation that children develop when the outer world has been made unavailable. He was, in the assessments of people who later knew him, intelligent and meticulous, and profoundly uncomfortable with disorder or deviation of any kind. He had a very specific sense of how things should be, how a family should function, how a man should present himself, what a Christian home should look like. And when reality did not match his sense of how things should be, he had no flexible response available. He could only push harder toward the ideal. He served in the army during World War II, an experience that took him to Europe during the last phase of the war, exposed him to violence, and produced in him, as it produced in many men of his generation, a combination of trauma and determined return to normalcy. He completed his accounting degree at the University of Michigan after his return, married Helen Morris Taylor in 1951, began building the family and the career that he believed were his responsibility to build. The career never delivered what he expected. He was a careful and competent accountant, reliable, thorough, the kind of employee who made no mistakes and generated no excitement. And the specific type of accounting work that produces exceptional advancement requires either a charismatic confidence in client-facing roles or an aggressive precision in technical roles, and List was suited for neither. He was too reserved for the first and too conventional for the second. He moved through positions, a savings and loan association, various firms, without accumulating the seniority or the salary that he had envisioned for himself. By the mid-1960s, when he purchased the house on Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey, he was already in the early stages of the financial difficulty that would eventually consume him. The house cost more than he could manage. He knew this when he bought it. He bought it anyway. The house was the 19th century mansion of a prosperous Westfield family. 19 rooms, oak floors throughout, marble fireplaces in the main rooms, the Tiffany skylight in the entry hall, a 45-foot ballroom on the ground floor. It had been built for people who had servants, who had a staff to maintain the woodwork and the ironwork and the heating system and the grounds. The List family did not have servants. The house cost them roughly twice what they could maintain it for, and it showed. The wallpaper was peeling in the rooms that were not in daily use. The heating was inadequate for the volume of space. The ballroom had become storage. List had moved his mother Alma into the third-floor apartment when he bought the house, an arrangement that allowed him access to her savings to help with the costs he could not otherwise cover. He did this without telling her what he was doing, or without fully explaining it. She was 80 years old and trusting, and not in a position to understand or question what her son was managing on her behalf. He drew on her account for years. He did not tell his wife Helen about the financial situation. He did not tell her when he lost his position at the bank in 1970, one of a series of professional reverses that accumulated through the late 1960s and early 1970s without his wife knowing they were happening. He put on his suit every morning and drove to the train station in his brown 1963 Chevrolet Impala, and he sat in the waiting room at Newark Penn Station reading newspapers while Helen believed he was at work. He did this for months. He was running out of everything: money, prospects, his mother's savings, the time before Helen would discover that their life was not what he had told her it was. He was also, he believed, losing his family to the world. His wife's health was deteriorating. She had contracted syphilis in a previous marriage before she met John, and the disease had not been properly treated and was now affecting her mental and physical functioning. She drank. She was not the wife he had envisioned when he married her. His eldest daughter, Patricia, was involved with a local theater group whose influence List found alarming. The people she was spending time with, the ideas she was being exposed to, the specific drift away from the Lutheran faith and the Lutheran values that had organized his own life and that he believed were the only adequate foundation for a human existence. Patricia was 16. She was becoming someone he did not recognize. His son, John Jr., had asked questions about Christianity that List found troubling. Not the innocent questions of a child working through his faith, but the probing skepticism of a young person who was not convinced. This was, to List, a spiritual emergency, and his youngest, Frederick, was 13 years old and being raised in a world that List had concluded was fundamentally hostile to the values that would save his soul. He sat in the waiting room at Newark Penn Station, day after day, month after month, reading the newspapers that reported the continuing degradation of American culture and reading the Bible and thinking about what needed to happen. By November of 1971, he had decided. The decision was not impulsive. He had thought about it carefully and had prayed about it and had arrived, through a process that was organized and thorough in exactly the way everything he did was organized and thorough, at the conclusion that the merciful thing was to kill his family. If they died now, before they had fully turned from God, their souls could be saved. If they continued to live in the world that was pulling them away from the faith, Helen into illness and drink, Patricia into theater, John Jr. into doubt, Frederick into an uncertain future, they might be lost permanently. He could not kill himself, because suicide is an unforgivable sin in the Lutheran tradition. He could not watch his family be destroyed. The only option, as he had constructed it, was to send them to heaven and then face the consequences. He planned the day with the care he gave everything. He cancelled the newspaper delivery and the milk delivery. He arranged for the mail to be held. He taped the organ music to the intercom, the church music that had been the soundtrack of his life. the Lutheran hymns of his childhood, the devotional sounds that meant faith and order and the world as it should be. He selected which lights to leave on so that the house would appear inhabited from the outside. He cleaned his guns. On November 9th, 1971, he went home for the last time as John List. And the next morning, he was gone. And the music played, and nobody noticed for 28 days. The officer who found the intercom panel in the kitchen turned it off. The organ music stopped. The house was silent for the first time since November 9th. Westfield, New Jersey in 1971 was a specific kind of American place, a prosperous commuter suburb of New York City, the kind of town that existed in a ring around the metropolitan area, organized around the train station that connected it to Manhattan and the specific culture of men who went to the city to work and came home to the suburbs to live. The houses were large and well-maintained and close enough together for neighbors to know each other's routines. The churches were full on Sunday. The schools were good. The Little League teams had uniforms. The List family had been part of this community. Their children attended school. John volunteered at the church. Helen went to the grocery store. The family was not unusually close to their neighbors. John List's reserve did not encourage intimacy, but they were present and visible in the way that families in stable communities are present and visible. Known, recognizable, part of the ordinary fabric. When the bodies were discovered on December 7th, the community's reaction had the specific quality of shock that comes not from random violence, but from the revelation that something terrible had been happening in a house that everyone had seen from the outside without seeing inside. The neighbors who had noticed the lights and the music had noticed them for weeks and had not acted. The children's teachers had accepted the absence letters without following up. The mailman had collected the mail accumulation from the mailbox without concern. Westfield was a community of people who had missed something for 28 days. Reverend Raywinkle held a memorial service for the 5 members of the List family. He called on John List through the service to come forward. John List was in Denver by then. The 5 coffins were carried from the church in a procession. Helen's mother, Eve Morris, was present, the woman who had been calling the house for weeks without an answer, who had worried and had not acted quickly enough. She was photographed being comforted at the graveside. She had lost her daughter, her grandchildren, and her mother-in-law. She had also lost them twice, once when they died, and again when the bodies were found, and she learned that she had been worrying while the bodies were already cold. John List Jr.'s friends from school spoke to reporters. They described a quiet boy who had seemed normal, who had given no indication that anything was wrong. Patricia's theater friends described a girl who had been bright and excited about her future. Frederick's friends were 13 years old and did not know what to say. The house on Hillside Avenue sat empty for years. Nobody wanted to buy it. The bank eventually took possession of the property. The structure deteriorated. The Tiffany skylight was taken out and sold. The marble fireplaces were removed. Eventually the building was demolished and the lot was redeveloped. But in December of 1971, it was still standing, with the police tape and the evidence markers and the specific heaviness of a place where something irrevocable had happened, and the community of Westfield was processing the fact that the man who had been their neighbor had planned this for months and had executed it with care and had driven to the airport with the music still playing and had been, as far as they knew, somewhere in the country, living under a different name, going to church. Helen Morris List was 46 years old. She had been married before to a man named Marvin Taylor, who had died, and had a daughter from that marriage, a daughter named Brenda, who was not in the house on November 9th and who survived. Helen had married John in 1951 when she was in her mid-20s, had built a life with him, had raised his children in the house on Hillside Avenue. She drank, by the later accounts of people who knew her. Her health was deteriorating. She was not the wife John had envisioned, and the house was not the house they had imagined, and the marriage was not the marriage either of them would have chosen. But she was alive, and she had a daughter who loved her, and she had 3 children who needed her, and John List had decided that her deteriorating soul was better served by a bullet than by time. Patricia List was 16 years old. She was involved with the local theatre group, which her father found alarming. She was, by the accounts of her friends, bright and outgoing and genuinely talented. The kind of teenager who finds in theatre the specific environment where her qualities are recognized and her energy has somewhere to go. She wanted to be an actress. This desire, in John List's framework, was evidence of the world pulling her away from what mattered. John Jr. was 15. He had asked questions about his faith that his father considered spiritually dangerous. He was at the age when boys begin the process of separating their developing views from their parents' views, which is the ordinary work of adolescence, and which John List experienced as apostasy. Frederick was 13. He was the youngest, the most abstract threat in his father's reasoning, a child not yet clearly in danger, but whose future List had decided to foreclose in any case. The 5 of them, wife, mother, daughter, 2 sons, were John List's family, and he killed them, methodically and without apparent emotion, over the course of a day in early November. The bodies were not discovered for 28 days. The neighbors had noticed things, the unchanging lights, the absence of movement, the music, but had not acted. The children's teachers had received the letters about extended absences and had not followed up. The mail carrier delivered nothing. The newspaper stopped being delivered. The house sat on Hillside Avenue with its lights on and its music playing, the specific appearance of habitation in a house that contained only the dead. Helen's mother, Eve Morris, had been calling the house for weeks and receiving no answer. She lived in another state. She worried. She did not act on the worry quickly enough. The Reverend Rawinkle had received the 5-page letter and, by various accounts, was uncertain what to do with it, whether it was genuine, whether to call the police. He waited, and the music played. The 5-page letter that List left for Reverend Rawinkle has been widely reprinted and analyzed. It is, in its way, one of the more remarkable documents in American criminal history, not because it is shocking in its content, but because of the tone. It is the letter of a man who believes he has thought carefully about a difficult situation and arrived at the right conclusion, and who is sharing that conclusion in the manner of a person filing a report. He wrote about the financial situation in specific terms: the mortgage arrears, the bank account balances, the debts. He wrote about Helen's illness. He wrote about his fears for his children's souls. He wrote that he believed he was saving them. He wrote that he was sorry for any pain this would cause to others, but that he had concluded there was no other way. He asked Reverend Rawinkle to pray for his family and for him. He signed it with his full name. He noted in a postscript that the lights had been left on to save the neighbors from the emotional shock of discovering the house dark when help arrived. Even in the postscript, he was being considerate of other people's feelings. He had planned the day carefully, in the way of an accountant planning a procedure, the order of operations, the contingencies, the cleanup. He shot his wife Helen first, in the kitchen, shortly after the children left for school. He dragged her body to the ballroom and put her in a sleeping bag. He went upstairs to his mother's apartment on the 3rd floor and shot Alma above the left eye. He could not carry her body down to the ballroom. She was heavy and the stairs were long, and left her where she fell. He went back to the kitchen and made himself lunch. He waited for the children to come home from school. When Patricia arrived in the early afternoon, he shot her in the kitchen. He carried her to the ballroom. When John Jr. arrived, he shot him, carried him to the ballroom. When Frederick arrived, he shot him, carried him to the ballroom. He arranged the 4 bodies in their sleeping bags in a row on the ballroom floor. the 4 members of his immediate family, his wife and his 3 children, neatly ordered as he had ordered everything else in his life. He left his mother on the floor of her apartment because he could not carry her down. He left their hands folded and placed the sleeping bags with care. He wrote the 5-page letter to Reverend Ravinkle. He wrote shorter notes to his children's teachers, explaining that the family would be away for an extended period and asking that their absences be excused. He cancelled the newspaper delivery and the milk delivery and arranged for the mail to be held. He set the intercom to play church music on a loop. He turned off most of the lights in the house, leaving a smaller number on to suggest habitation. He drove to Kennedy Airport. He parked his car in the long-term lot. He had already begun thinking about his new name. What John List did for the next 18 years is, in its way, as extraordinary as what he did on November the 9th, 1971. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so entirely undramatic. He did not flee to a foreign country. He did not adopt an elaborate disguise or construct a complex false identity with forged documents. He did not change his appearance in any significant way. He did not stop being who he was. He drove to Kennedy Airport and boarded a flight to Denver, Colorado. He had some money. He had withdrawn what remained in the family's accounts in the days before the murders and had what was left of his mother's savings, which amounted to somewhere between a few hundred and a few $1,000s. Not much, but enough to begin. He found a room. He found work. He obtained, through means that investigators would later find difficult to fully establish, identification documents in the name of Robert Peter Clark. He was 46 years old in 1971, which meant that Robert Clark's background needed to account for 46 years of life that investigators could not verify. He built that background carefully and over time, finding positions where the background check was not thorough, establishing a record of residence and employment that could withstand a casual inquiry. He joined a Lutheran church. He began teaching Sunday school. The specific quality of this detail, that John List, who had killed his family in part because he feared they were drifting from the Lutheran faith, who had left church music playing in the house where their bodies lay, immediately upon arriving in Denver, resumed his Lutheran practice and his Sunday school teaching, says something important about him. The murders were not a rejection of the values that had organized his life. They were, in his understanding, an expression of those values. He could kill his family and teach Sunday school the following month, because in his framework, both acts were consistent. He found work as a financial controller at a Denver company. He was, as Robert Clark, the same employee he had been as John List, careful, competent, reliable. The kind of accountant who did not make errors and did not generate enthusiasm. He was quiet in the office. He was punctual. He gave nobody any reason to think about him more than necessary. He dated. He was, by accounts from the period, a somewhat stiff and formal presence in social situations, the kind of man who did not make easy conversation, but who was unfailingly polite and who conveyed, through his bearing, the specific respectability of a religious and orderly man. Women who met him through church activities found him suitable rather than exciting. In 1977, he met a woman named Dolores Miller at a church event in Denver. She was recently widowed, with children of her own. She found in him what many people found in John List when they encountered him on the surface: a quiet, responsible, church-going man of conventional values who would be a reliable presence in her life. They dated for years. They married in 1985. She did not know his real name. She did not know why he had moved from the Midwest. She did not know about the house in Westfield, the 5 bodies in the sleeping bags, the organ music, the 5-page letter. She knew him as Bob Clark. Bob Clark taught Sunday school. Bob Clark went to work and came home and said his prayers and paid his taxes. They moved to Richmond, Virginia in 1988. He continued working as an accountant. He continued attending church. His neighbors found him quiet and pleasant and unremarkable. He was, in the specific and functional sense, a good neighbor. He mowed his lawn, he waved hello. He did not give anyone any reason to look at him twice. He had been doing this for 17 years. The FBI had his photograph from 1971. They had his fingerprints. They knew he had flown to Denver. They did not know about Robert Clark. The Social Security number he was using had been issued to a man named Robert Clark, who had died in childhood, a common technique for assuming a new identity in the pre-digital era, made possible by the fact that the Social Security Administration did not cross-reference its records with death records in any systematic way. The number worked. The name worked. The life worked. He was 63 years old in 1988. He had been Robert Clark for 17 years. He was a husband and a neighbor and an accountant and a Sunday school teacher. And he was the most wanted fugitive in New Jersey. Nobody knew where he was. And then America's Most Wanted put the Frank Bender bust on television. In 1988, the producers of America's Most Wanted, a television program that had just begun airing, built around the premise of presenting fugitive cases to national audiences and inviting viewer tips, were approached by New Jersey prosecutors about the List case. The case had the qualities that worked well for the program. A compelling story, a clear suspect, a national audience that might have encountered him anywhere in the country. The segment posed a specific problem. The most recent photographs of John List were 17 years old. He had been 46 when he disappeared. He would be 63 in 1988. A 17-year-old photograph was worse than useless. It would prompt viewers to look for a middle-aged man rather than an elderly one, which was more likely to send tips in the wrong direction than the right one. The producers consulted a forensic sculptor named Frank Bender. Bender was a photographer and sculptor from Philadelphia who had been developing techniques for producing accurate representations of how faces age over long periods of time. He worked from skulls and from photographs, combining what he knew about bone structure and genetics and the specific visible effects of aging. How the skin loses elasticity in particular ways, how the fat pads in the face redistribute, how the jawline changes, how the eyes recede slightly into deeper orbital hollows, to produce representations that matched or closely approximated the actual appearance of people who had aged substantially since their last known photograph. He had studied List's photographs extensively, the family photographs from Westfield, the police photographs, anything that showed his bone structure and the distribution of tissue on his face. He had noted the specifics, the square jaw, the flat effect, the German-American facial architecture that was characteristic of Bay City, Michigan in the 1920s. He had applied his knowledge of how that type of face aged over 17 years on a man of List's general health and build. The bust he produced showed a man with jowls that the earlier photographs had not shown. The hairline was further back. The cheeks were slightly hollowed, and the wrinkles were placed in the specific way that the underlying bone structure would have directed them. The glasses were heavy-framed and conservative. The type, Bender reasoned, that a man of List's sensibility and limited financial means would choose. The bust was, by the standards of forensic sculpture in 1988, extraordinarily accurate. It looked, to the people who knew Robert Clark in Richmond, Virginia, very much like Bob Clark. The America's Most Wanted segment aired on May 21, 1989. The program showed the old photographs, showed the Bender bust, described the murders and the disappearance and the 17 years of fugitive status, and asked viewers to call if they knew anyone who resembled either image. A woman named Wanda Flannery lived near Robert Clark in Virginia. She knew him from church. He was on the vestry committee. He volunteered. He was present at the community events that organized parish life. She had, in 1987, seen a tabloid story about the List murders and had thought that the man in the old photographs looked something like Bob Clark. She had not reported it because the resemblance was to a 17-year-old photograph and the resemblance was not certain and she did not want to be wrong about a man she knew from church. When she saw the Bender bust on America's Most Wanted, the resemblance was no longer uncertain. She called the show's tip line. She was not the only person to call about Robert Clark. Several others from Virginia and possibly from Colorado called with the same name. The FBI cross-referenced the tips and focused on Robert Clark of Richmond. On the morning of June 1st, 1989, FBI agents went to the accounting firm in Richmond where Robert Clark worked. They identified themselves and asked to speak with him. He came out of his office. He was wearing a suit and tie, as he always wore a suit and tie. He looked like a mild-mannered 63-year-old accountant. He identified himself as Robert Clark. They took him to a local FBI office and fingerprinted him. The fingerprints matched the John List fingerprints in the New Jersey State Police database. He had been 17 years, 6 months, and 23 days at large. He maintained the Robert Clark identity for a short while after the fingerprints came back. Then he stopped. His second wife, Dolores, told what had happened, reportedly said that she could not believe it, that she had known Bob Clark and had loved Bob Clark, and this was not the man she knew. She was right, in a sense. Bob Clark had been a real person, had gone to work and gone to church and taught Sunday school and been a husband and a neighbor in every functional sense. The man who had killed his family in Westfield in November of 1971 had been encased in 17 years of ordinary life, and the ordinary life was not entirely a performance. It was also what he was. Both things were true. Robert Clark was John List. John List was also Robert Clark, and the bust had found him. The trial took place in 1990. List was charged with 5 counts of murder. He did not deny having committed the killings. His defense was not that he hadn't done it, but that his reasons for doing it had been sincere. That his financial situation had been genuinely desperate. That his wife's illness had been genuinely deteriorating. That his fears for his children's souls had been genuine, and that he had killed them because he believed it was the merciful thing to do. He said, in testimony, that he had sent his family to heaven. He said that suicide was an unforgivable sin in the Lutheran faith, which meant that if he had killed himself instead, he would be damned. By killing his family first, and then intending to turn himself in, he had given them the chance at salvation that he could not give them any other way. The jury did not find this reasoning exculpatory. He was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. He was 65 years old. He appealed. The appeals failed. He served the sentences in Trenton State Prison in New Jersey. His second wife, Dolores Clark, divorced him after the conviction. She told reporters that she had not known anything about his past and that she had loved the man she thought she had married. In prison, he continued his religious practice. He gave occasional interviews in which he maintained, without apparent discomfort, the position that what he had done had been the right thing to do, given the circumstances, and that he expected to be judged by God rather than by man in the ultimate sense. He did not express remorse in the conventional form. He expressed something more like explanation, the organized, measured account of a man who believes he has thought through a decision carefully and arrived at the correct conclusion, and who sees no reason to revise the conclusion simply because other people find it monstrous. He died on March 21st, 2008, in a hospital in Trenton of complications from pneumonia. He was 82 years old. He had served 18 years in prison, roughly the same amount of time he had been a fugitive. The Frank Bender bust became one of the most famous pieces of forensic sculpture in American history. Bender had produced, from old photographs and a knowledge of aging and bone structure, a representation of how John List would look in 1988 that was close enough to the actual man that a neighbor who had seen his face for 2 years at a Virginia Lutheran church recognized it on a television program. The specific quality of the List case that has kept it in the historical record, beyond the specific horror of the murders themselves, beyond the religious reasoning that most people find either baffling or monstrous or both, is the specific quality of his invisibility. He was not invisible because he was exceptional at evasion. He was not invisible because he had constructed an elaborate false identity or changed his appearance or adopted behaviors that made him unrecognizable. He was invisible because he was completely ordinary. The same quiet, religious, competent, mild-mannered accountant in Colorado and Virginia that he had been in New Jersey, doing the same things, saying the same things, presenting the same face. The FBI had his photograph. They had his fingerprints. They knew he had gone to Denver. They did not find him for 18 years, not because he was hiding in any dramatic sense, but because there was no mechanism in the American criminal justice system of the 1970s and 1980s for connecting a specific man living quietly under a different name in a mid-sized American city to the case file in New Jersey. He relied on the ordinary invisibility of the ordinary. The invisibility of a man who goes to church, does his work, pays his taxes, and gives his neighbors no reason to look at him. It worked for 18 years. The bust broke it. There is a question that the List case always raises, and that the trial's outcome did not fully address. What exactly was John List? He was not a serial killer. He killed once, a planned and organized act that he committed over the course of a single day and did not repeat. He was not a person with a criminal history. Before November 9, 1971, his record was entirely clean, a single speeding violation in 20 years of driving. He was not a person who expressed violence in his ordinary life. His former colleagues and neighbors consistently described him as quiet and mild and proper. He was a person who had, over months in a train station waiting room in Newark, constructed a logical framework for murder, a framework that drew on his financial situation, his wife's illness, his fears for his children, and his Lutheran theology, and who had then executed that framework with the same organized precision he brought to everything else he did. The organized precision is the thing that stays with you. Not the murders themselves, terrible as they were, but the systematic preparation, the cancellation of the newspaper delivery, the cancellation of the milk delivery, the arrangement for the mail to be held, the letters to the children's teachers asking that their absences be excused so that the school would not call the house and trigger an earlier investigation, the 5-page letter explaining everything, the organ music. He had thought about the organ music specifically. He had wanted the house to have the right atmosphere while the bodies waited to be found. The devotional sounds, the hymns, the specific quality of Lutheran piety that had organized his entire life. It was not incidental or accidental. He had taped the recording and set the intercom before he left as part of the plan. He drove to the airport knowing that the music was playing. He was thinking about the music when he boarded the plane to Denver. The Frank Bender bust that identified him in 1989 became, after the case, a landmark in forensic sculpture, a demonstration that it was possible to produce accurate representations of how a specific face would age over 17 years, and that such representations could be useful investigative tools. Bender went on to apply the same techniques to other cold cases, producing reconstructions that contributed to several additional identifications. The List case established the method. It also established something about the mechanics of ordinary invisibility. List was not invisible because he was clever. He was invisible because he was unremarkable. The FBI had his photograph and his fingerprints and knew he had flown to Denver and could not find him for 17 years, not because he had evaded them with skill, but because there was no systematic mechanism for finding a specific quiet man living quietly under a slightly different name in a mid-sized American city. The mechanism that found him was television, a program that put his face, or a sculpted approximation of it, in front of millions of viewers, one of whom happened to know him from church and had the specific combination of recognition and courage to make the call. John List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder in April of 1990 and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was 64 years old. His second wife, Dolores, divorced him after the conviction. She told reporters that the man she had married, Bob Clark, the quiet accountant who went to church and mowed the lawn and was a good husband, was not the person being tried in that courtroom. She did not know how both things could be true. Nobody did. In prison, List maintained his religious practice. He continued attending chapel services. He gave occasional interviews in which he maintained, without visible distress, that what he had done had been the right thing to do given the circumstances, and that he expected God's judgment to be the final one. He expressed something that looked like regret for the pain he had caused to others, to Helen's mother, to the children's friends, to the community of Westfield. He did not express what most people would recognize as remorse for the murders themselves. He died on March 21, 2008, in a hospital in Trenton, New Jersey, of complications from pneumonia. He was 82 years old. He had served 18 years in prison. He had been a fugitive for 18 years. The 2 periods were exactly the same length. He had spent his entire adulthood, every year from 1971 onward, as either a fugitive or a prisoner. He had, in the process, been a husband twice, a Sunday school teacher in 2 states, an accountant in 3 cities, a neighbor to people who described him as quiet and pleasant and entirely without menace. He had been all of those things. He had also been the man who set the organ music to play in the house on Hillside Avenue and driven to the airport. The List case has been studied extensively in the academic literature on family annihilators. Men, almost always men, who kill their entire immediate families and typically either kill themselves afterward or, as in List's case, disappear. The research identifies several consistent patterns. The family annihilator typically has a grandiose self-image and a profound inability to tolerate failure. He kills the family not in rage, but as a controlled act, often described as mercy. He has a strong need to control the narrative and typically leaves an explanation. And he understands himself as the responsible party for the family's welfare, and therefore as having the authority to terminate that welfare. John List fits every element of this profile with the precision of a textbook case. He had a grandiose self-image. He believed he deserved the house on Hillside Avenue and the career success that never came, and he concealed his failures rather than revising his expectations. He killed in control, not in rage. The day was planned, the sequence was organized, the aftermath was prepared for. He left a 5-page letter explaining himself because he needed the record to reflect his reasoning, and he believed, sincerely and without apparent doubt, that the murders were his responsibility to commit because the welfare of his family was his responsibility to manage. This is the specific quality that makes the List case disturbing beyond its individual horror. It is a case about the pathology of a certain kind of certainty. List was certain about what the right thing to do was. He was certain about what his religion required. He was certain about what his family needed. He was certain about what the world was doing to them and what the only adequate response was. And his certainty was organized and articulate and expressed in full sentences in a 5-page letter. And it produced 5 deaths and 18 years of a different life and an eventual reckoning in a courtroom in New Jersey. He believed to the end that he had done the right thing. He said this: He maintained it. He went to his grave in a prison cemetery in New Jersey in 2008, having never revised the conclusion he had reached in the waiting room at Newark Penn Station in 1971. Patricia would have been 53. John Jr. would have been 52. Frederick would have been 50. The organ music played for 28 days in the empty house. Somewhere in Colorado, John List was going to church. He was already Robert Clark. He was already in every way he could manage starting over.